Everyone who has played Schubert's music, everyone who has listened to it, has their own Schubert narrative. It's something that evolves over the years with new ideas and perceptions, discoveries. It seems that this composer belongs to each one of us individually. We know a great deal about Schubert, but we will never know enough. The gaps are filled with a host of personal theories and conjectures. This is my version of Schubert's story after more than 50 years of playing his music and reading and writing about him. This is the truth as I believe it to have been, but the skeleton of undisputed facts can be fleshed up in different ways, and others will tell the story from other points of view. The man remains for us an enigma, perhaps exactly as he intended. I have here a book by Franz Heinrich Böck. It's a dictionary, really. Vienna's living writers, artists, and dilettantes in matters of art. And it's also a guidebook to the beauty spots of Vienna and so on. But in those days, you could visit famous people with a visiting card. If we look up Schubert, composer, living in the Wipplingerstraße, number 350. Actually, his two brothers, Ferdinand and Ignaz, are also mentioned, but they are not living in such salubrious quarters. Ignaz is very much working at the schoolhouse of Schubert's father. Salieri is listed on the opposite page, and of course he lives in the Spiegelgasse, where Schubert had visited him many times to take lessons up until 1816. And in the section devoted to the poets, there is Johann Mayrhofer. Mayrhofer is here listed as an imperial book reviser, in other words, a censor, and he lives at number 389 of the Wipplingerstraße, so a different house from Schubert, and that's the whole point of 1821. It's a new year of freedom for the composer. He's living on his own for the first time in his life. And there's a song written, Die Gefangenensänger, which is about birds. Some birds are free to fly in the open air, and others are confined in cages. Schubert makes the contrast very beautifully in the song, and it's quite clear that it refers to freedom of various sorts. Political freedom, the freedom to think what you wish, and also sexual freedom. The reason why Schubert was able to live on his own was that he had at last the prospect of some money in his pocket. Friends had arranged for his songs to be published privately, which is to say they were still printed properly by the firm of Diabelli, but they were sort of sold privately at various events. Diabelli was not prepared to envisage losses. His misjudgment of the greatness of Schubert was of epic proportions. But 7 opus numbers in 1821 were published, 20 songs. And it's these songs that began to circulate. Schubert was now a member of the Gesellschaft der Musikfreunde, so it was possible for his music to be performed at their concerts. He was gaining a reputation outside those in his inner circle who had long admired him. Of course, the first song to be published was Erlkönig. That was Opus 1, and Opus 2 was Gretchen am Spinnrad. Der Wanderer, that had caused quite a lot of attention when it was first performed, and Wanderers Nachtlied. And Opus 5 is a magnificent opus entirely dedicated to Goethe, and this despite the fact that Schubert had absolutely no feedback from the great poet. Opus 6, and this came in August of 1821, included the famous Mayrhofer setting Memnon. Death and the Maiden followed in Opus 7. In these 20 songs, there are 13 at least of what we would consider the great Schubert. And he had a lot of work. Seeing them through the press, one underestimates how much work there was in the correcting of proofs, the corresponding with publishers and so on. And some of the greatest work was done at the last minute in these proofs, which were sadly destroyed by the publishers as soon as they'd made the corrections. Schubert also took on a job at the Kärntnertor Theatre as a coach. He was supposed to teach Caroline Unger the role of Dorabella in Così fan tutte, but he seems to have failed to make the appointments. It was an arrangement that didn't work. Certainly, he was taken up with the act of composition. And when he was composing, he was in another world, no longer aware of the time. The disappearance of Mayrhofer from Schubert's life, whether or not there was a real estrangement or simply an understanding of new circumstances, has never been proved, but the less Mayrhofer there was, the more there was of Franz von Schober. And it was thanks to the energy of Schober, who loved putting on events and being the arranger of things, that there were a great many Schubertiads, as these evenings of Schubert's music now began to be called, sometimes going on to 3 in the morning. On these occasions, the composer seems to have sung his songs himself. Accompanying himself at the piano, he was actually a baritone, but he seems to have had that kind of voix de compositeur where it was possible for him to sing the songs in the original key in a falsetto. So there were a great many more performances in Vienna of the songs and also of the part songs, which were a central part of the composer's popularity, these works particularly for male chorus. But as he was publishing the older songs, he was certainly, of course, composing new ones all the time. Schubert is also becoming aware of the system in Vienna, a very hierarchical society, where one had to understand who was important, whom it was necessary to flatter, and so on. Whether he admired the poetry of Carolina Pichler or not, she was a potential, powerful ally in a city where everything was accomplished through contacts. And we may be certain that all this new side of Schubert's life was as a result of advice coming from Schober, not from Mayrhofer. It may have been Schober who brought the composer's attention to an aspect of Goethe's writing that he had probably overlooked. Here in the specifically Viennese edition of Goethe's work, we find the poems of the Westöstliche Divan. Actually, these poems had been written as a result of the research in Vienna of the great Joseph von Hammer, sometimes known as Hammer-Purgstall, who was really a great expert in Oriental languages, which Goethe was not. But he took these poems researched by Hammer, and turned them into sensual, erotic, quasi-Oriental gold. Behind a mask of emulating the voluptuous poetry of the 14th century Persian poet Hafiz, Goethe in his 60s produced work of greater sexual intensity than ever before. And it seems in 1821, Schubert was very much in the mood to write music for this kind of poetry. In the song Versunken, the lover caresses cascades of wonderful hair. His 5 fingers are described by the poet as a 5-toothed comb, and they also become the pianist's fingers darting around the keyboard. In this music, cascades of semiquavers are the tresses in which the lover luxuriates. It's reminiscent of that wonderful passage from John Donne: license my roving hands and let them go before, behind, between, above, below. It's very doubtful whether Mayrhofer would have approved of a song like Versunken, with its open sexual references. There were no more lectures from Mayrhofer, of course. Schubert was in daily contact with the free-living Franz von Schober, whose Swedish upbringing had made him impervious to Viennese proprieties. If this composer ever had a good time in his life, privately, and unknown to us, undocumented, it was between 1821 and 1822.
Ein Haupt so rund, verlockend kraus, ein Haupt so rund. Und darf ich dann in solchen reichen Haaren mit vollen Händen hin und wieder fahren, darf ich mich von Herzensgrund gesund und küss ich Stirn, Boden, Auge, Mund, dann bin ich frisch und immer wieder wund. Dann bin ich frisch und immer wieder wund und immer wieder wund. Der 5-gezackte Kamm, wo sollt ihr schnacken? Er geht schon wieder zu den Locken. Versagt sich nicht dem Spiel, so zahlt zum Scherz, so lieber viel, so zahlt zum Scherz, so lieber viel. Doch wie man auf dem Köpfchen kraut, doch wie man auf dem Köpfchen kraut, man wird in solchen reichen Haaren für ewig auf und nieder fahren, ewig auf und nieder fahren, ewig auf und nieder fahren. Verlocken kraus, ein Haupt so rund.
The great baritone Johann Michael Vogel performed Erlkönig at the Kärntnertor Theatre. Big moment in terms of Schubert having arrived, really. Although the song was accompanied by Anselm Hüttenbrenner, also a composer, one of Schubert's close friends, a very brilliant pianist. Interestingly, Schubert decided not to undertake those throbbing triplets in the accompaniment himself. He had greater things to do anyway. He was busy composing, and Goethe continued to be a major source of inspiration. One of the really big Goethe songs, the grandest, is Grenzen der Menschheit. Just as in Ganymede, a boy submits to the gods. And in Prometheus, Prometheus defies the gods. Grenzen der Menschheit is a reckoning of the limitations of mankind. In order to do this, Schubert has to paint a big figure like in a Michelangelo fresco, but not a God that is frightening, not a God who's awesome. Awesome, yes, in a way, but kindly. The poem says, wenn der uralte heilige Vater, and that word father always means a great deal when it comes to songs by Schubert. The heilige Vater mit gelassener Hand. He's actually creating things with a relaxed, kindly, almost casual hand. How do you get casualness and greatness and imposing musical quality in one combined way? Well, you can do if you are Franz Schubert. Magnificence and geniality combined. Schubert is always able to get to the very heart of the matter. But the discovery of the poems of the Westöstliche Divan, the poems that had inspired Versunken, this produced in Schubert a response, a musical response that was something that he'd never quite experienced before. And I think it may be said that the first of the Suleika songs, Suleika, the Oriental princess enthralled to Hatem, her mentor and protector who's not with her, they must exchange messages via the wind. The east wind brings messages, she sends messages back by the west. This particular challenge for Schubert was most magnificently set and perhaps resulted in his greatest love song. The wind is announced right at the beginning. And then with the gentle accent at the very beginning of each bar, there is something resembling an oriental undulation, showing the languid nature of the woman waiting in the heat of Persia to receive this amorous message. If we listen to that key of B minor and the rustling speed of the semiquavers, we can hear also in what way the unfinished symphony is related to the song. But the thing is the way the music builds symphonically. Even without the voice part at the top, one can sense the way that Schubert literally takes the song to a magnificent climax, as Suleika imagines and thinks of the absent lover's presence, what it will be like to be reunited with him. The whole song is like an erotic mural of gradually aroused and then consummated desire, which dies down and subsides into a matchless and blissful aftermath, which is a passage of music that has received the praise of almost everybody. It's surely this part of the song that made Johannes Brahms refer to it as the most beautiful song in the world. Written at the same time is the song Geheimnis. This is about a love that is mute, a love where passion is conveyed with smiles and expressions, not open words. It has charm, it is flirtatious. But both songs, very different as they are about the kind of love that requires discretion and secrecy, where it is not possible for the lovers to meet openly, where longing and imagination play an important part. In 1821, in the summer, there is a wonderful episode in the life of Schubert and the Schubertians. About 40 kilometers to the west of Vienna, there is the castle of Atzenbruck. It was owned by Josef Derfel, who was Franz von Schober's uncle. And he was extremely happy that this castle should be opened to the Schubertians for their party games. They could be there together, they could make music in the music room. There's some wonderful drawings by Leopold Kupelwieser of this Atzenbruck atmosphere, what happened at Atzenbruck. But firstly, here's a picture of the composer himself in 1821, drawn by Kupelwieser. As for these colored drawings of Kupelwieser, they refer to the life of young people enjoying themselves. There's a beautiful one of a carriage with two lovely horses and a whole lot of people in it about to go on an expedition from Atzenbruck, and Schubert is to be seen in the left-hand corner earnestly speaking with somebody. In another picture, the Gesellschaftsspiel der Schubertianer. It is a game of charades that's depicted. Schubert sits in the corner, obviously having played. Perhaps he enjoyed accompanying the charades with music. What is depicted is the fall of man, and it is Schober who is pretending to be the snake around the tall man surrounded by Adam and Eve at the bottom, the tall man being a tree, Schober the snake in the tree. And obviously this is the fall of man as the answer to the game of charades. Schubert is sitting at a piano with a beautiful dog whose name we know was Drago. There are no pedals on the piano either. It's a very beautiful and spontaneous reflection. We can visit Atzenbruck today. It's a Schubert museum, and see this place where for a number of summers the Schubertians so enjoyed life. In 1821, after that episode of the summer was over, Schubert and Schober were invited to be the guests of Johann Dankersreiter. He may have been related to Schober, or he might have simply been a friend. He was a bishop, and he had a palace, Schloss Ochsenberg, in St. Pölten. And it was there that Schubert and Schober lived together for 2 months in what must have seemed idyllic conditions for the composer. There was a large room with a piano, 2 double beds, large number of sociable people to be visited in the neighborhood. They had time to drink beer and smoke their pipes, read in each other's company. All other musical plans were set aside for the composition of Alfonso und der Strille, the great opera they were going to work on there together. Of course, may I say, I don't doubt that it is quite something to write an opera libretto, but to write it orchestrated, the work pressure was very much on Schubert, and he responded magnificently, as he always did. I think that this time was one of the most special in all Schubert's life. There are no songs from that period. Everything is dedicated to the opera. Vogel, on the other hand, perhaps aware that since the fading of Mayerhofer's star, Schober was the one person in the world who had more influence over Schubert than he did, doubted whether anything was going to come of this opera. Not that he doubted that Schubert was a musical genius, but he certainly didn't think that Schober was the suitable librettist for such a project. After 2 months of living together, Schubert and Schober returned to Vienna in November 1821 with a great deal of the opera already composed. In 1822, no fewer than 33 solo songs were written, this despite the fact that Schubert had on his plate the completion of the enormous opera Alfonso und der Strille, written in collaboration with Schober and largely worked on in St. Pölten in those idyllic autumn months of 1821. When he moved back to Vienna, his new address was the Goethe-Weigerhof, Spiegelgasse 9, not that far from Salieri. And it must be said that what had seemed an idyll when the two of these friends worked together on the big opera was now continued because they now shared an apartment. Going back all those days to 1816, 1817, when Schober and Schubert had lived together. One must appreciate that in this period Schubert lived a life of increasing respect and affection as far as a wider public was concerned. He did not lead a life in obscurity. A very important periodical, the Wiener Zeitschrift für Kunst, Literatur, Theater und Mode, consecrated an entire article to his songs, starting the edition of the 23rd of March, 1822. And in this article, which I have here, it's very clear that these songs have made an enormous impression on people who are not considered simply the friends of the composer, but people in the world of the Vienna arts. Jedermann wird in seinem Werken auf dem ersten Blick den Charakter des Genies. Anybody, on looking at this music, would see at first glance aspects of genius. Well, if Schubert had been the kind of person who truly believed in himself, he would have made much of an article like this. But it seems that he always preferred to keep his light under a bushel. There was a new generation of friends. Many of his school friends were now at an age of moving away from Vienna, marrying and so on. And the gifted young painter Moritz von Schwind became a third in a triumvirate with Schober. There was a weekly Schubertiad, and there were readings 3 times a week. Schober was very keen on these, and Schubert was very attentive to them. There was something of a tendency for these gatherings to be dominated by a rowdy element of young men of the hunting, shooting, fishing kind. And Schubert did not find this at all comfortable. But one of the older generation of friends was Matthias von Collin. Schubert had first set a beautiful duet of his, Licht und Liebe, in 1816. And Collin became an increasingly important man in the Viennese establishment. He was charged with being tutor to the Duke de Reichstag, who was the 11-year-old son of Napoleon, and Marie-Louise of Austria. The poor boy lived in seclusion at Schönbrunn, and Collin taught him. Yes, he was powerful. Collin was really connected with the top brass in Vienna. But he was also the cousin of Joseph von Spaun. And Joseph von Spaun had gone to live in Linz to take up a job as a tax inspector. And he never wrote letters to his cousin Collin either. So poet and composer got together and wrote one of the most extraordinary pieces in Lieder history. It was even sent to Joseph von Spaun, this letter, this musical joke, in the form of a letter. The manuscript was sent to him, accusing him of treachery for not being in touch. Schubert was very seldom interested in funny music. He was not a comic by nature. But here, in parodying and adapting the style of Italian opera, he excels himself.
Und nimmer schreibst du, bleibest uns verloren, ein starr verstummter, nun für ew'ge Zeit. Vielleicht, weil neue Freude du erkoren,
After the initial bombast of the opening, the music changes to something pleading, and an incredible passage where Schubert uses the modulations to suggest a mounting hysteria. To those of us who know about turntables and the speed of records, it sounds like a disc gradually speeding up.
Für jeden bist du schriftkarg nicht gesessen, für manchen kamen Briefe angeflogen, und nach der Elle hast du sie gemessen, doch uns Barbar hast du dein Herz entzogen.
At the end of the song, it is in full Italianate dramatic flight, high seas and all. This is one of the most heated songs that Schubert ever wrote, and it was all tongue-in-cheek.
Schwing euch Kind zu bange Klagen aus dem Peterbrust hervor. Aus dem Peterbrust, ja, aus dem Peterbrust hervor. Aus dem Peterbrust hervor, aus dem Peterbrust hervor. Aus der Brust hervor.
Schubert tended to fall in love with the very things that he was parodying. So in that comic letter to Joseph von Spaun, he's making fun of the very kind of opera that was going to prove fatal to his own operatic ambitions. And sure enough, Rossini had taken over the Kirchensaal Theatre. The whole of Vienna could only think of Rossini's music. And Alfonso und Estrella was turned down. It didn't help, perhaps, that Vogel, behind the scenes, was against the whole project anyway. This was, nevertheless, an extremely fertile period for song. As Joseph von Spaun later wrote, anyone who's seen Schubert of a morning occupied with composition, aglow with his eyes shining, and even his speech changed, like a somnambulist, well, nobody will ever forget the impression. In the afternoon, continues Spaun, he was another person, but he was gentle and deeply sensitive, and he didn't show his feelings. He preferred to keep them to himself. At this point, Schubert is close to Matthias von Collin, admiring him, very much a senior figure, produced a song that is perhaps one of the most often performed in the concert hall today. It has a great deal in common with Suleika in terms of its moto perpetuo semiquaver accompaniment. It's the song Der Zwerg. This is the type of basis for what one might call a symphonic type of song, an unfolding movement, a seemingly neutral accompaniment on which a whole number of succeeding scenes can be built. It's the most concise of all Schubert's gruesome ballads, and it is gruesome. It deals with the murder of the queen by the dwarf, and also one of the most magically effective because of Schubert's tight control of form. There were other important events in 1822. Schubert's friend, Franz von Brockmann, went to Erlangen to hear the lectures of Schelling, something actually that was forbidden by Austrian law. Metternich didn't want students getting wild ideas from foreign philosophers. But in Erlangen, Bruckmann became very good friends with a poet called August von Platen, Graf von Platen. And he brought back with him two extraordinary texts which he handed over to Schubert specifically to compose. Die Liebe hat gelogen is a song of enormous pride. Love has lied. And it is an absolute extraordinary thing that instead of somebody woebegone and sorrowful, we have the pride of the aristocratic Platen who has been betrayed. But the prevailing mood of the song is one of anger, that someone should have lied to him. And we know very rarely the circumstances of the song, because Platen was homosexual and because he'd been let down by one of the many people who appeared to love him because of his wealth and power more than they really did. So the song is man to man, as it were. And it's extraordinary that Schubert understands this. What Bruckmann told him about Platen, we shall never know. We know a great deal more about the character of Johann Senn. Senn, who was arrested by the police and sent into exile in 1820. In 1822, Schubert sets 2 Senn songs. There were those who said that if this poet had stayed around in Vienna instead of being exiled, he would have exerted a very important counter-influence on Schubert, someone very different from Schober. But it's also part of Schubert's political bravery that, considering Senn as persona non grata, that he will still set these songs and indeed later publish them. If there was ever a portrait of someone strong, determined, defiant, someone who didn't care about endangering himself in terms of politics and life, the introduction to the Senn setting Selige Welt seems to describe such a person. The other song was completely different, not to be confused with the title, Schwanengesang, of the big cycle at the end of Schubert's life, but this is about the swan song, the melancholy note that the swan is said to sing before he dies. Here, Schubert's enormous sorrow, his compassion for his friend's predicament, for his friend's fate, an exile that was as good as a death sentence. The tenderness that the composer feels for the friendship of Senn, all beautifully coming together in this remarkable little song. In July 1822, Schubert had a dream that he noted down in his own handwriting. The document still exists. Once my father took us to a feast. There my brothers became very merry. I, however, was sad. Then my father approached me and bade me enjoy the delicious dishes, but I could not. Whereupon my father, becoming very angry, banished me from his sight. I turned my footsteps and my heart full of infinite love for those who disdained it. I wandered into far-off regions. For long years, I felt torn between the greatest grief and the greatest love. My father took me once more to his favorite garden. He asked me whether I liked it, but the garden wholly repelled me. Doch mir war der Garten widrig. But I dared not say so. Then, reddening, he asked me a second time, did the garden please me? I denied it, trembling. At that my father struck me and I fled. Once again, in 1822, Schloss Atzenbruck was the scene of the Schubertians having parties, enjoying themselves in the open air, performing indoors of an evening. The song Wer nie sein Brot mit Tränen aß dates from September 1822. It's a song that was composed and then put together with two others composed 6 years earlier to make a cycle, the Gesänge des Hafners. And the whole was published as a thank you to Dankesreiter at Oxenberg for his hospitality the previous year. This was among the 12 songs and various part songs published in 1822. As in the song Suleika, we are astounded by Schubert's daring in terms of modulations. This sad harp-accompanied song where the old harper tells us of his infinite woes is given an edge of desperation simply through the power of modulation.
Uns hinein, ihr lasst den Armen schuldig werden, dann überlasst ihn der Pein, denn alle Schuld rächt sich treiben uns hinein. Ihr lasst den Armen schuldig werden, dann überlasst ihr ihn der Pein, denn alle Schuld rächt sich auf Erden. Ihr lasst den Armen schuldig werden, dann überlasst ihr ihn der Pein, denn alle Schuld rächt sich auf Erden.
In October 1822, Schubert returned to live and work. That was the deal. If he had a roof over his head there, I think he was expected to teach. He returned to the schoolhouse in the Rossau. The violinist Louis Schlösser visited Schubert there in the Grüntorgasse and was surprised by the absence of any sign of comfort in the composer's workroom. There were stringed instruments and stools in disorder, music piled up on the piano, and all in all, a rather bleak and squalid picture. And yet, this is where Schubert completed his Mass in A-flat major, Goethe songs like Der Musensohn and Willkommen und Abschied, and the Wanderer Fantasy for piano. Despite the poverty-stricken surroundings, these were works composed with a peace of mind that was soon to vanish. The 13th of December should have been a red-letter day. The Opus 12 songs dedicated to Dankesreiter, the host of the previous autumn, were published, and the love song Suleika und Geheimes, Opus 14, appeared dedicated to my friend, Franz von Schober. And yet, it is at this time exactly that many biographers calculate that Schubert must have discovered that he was suffering from a dangerous and shaming illness. And this brings us to the year 1823, which is full of surprises and unknowns. February 1823 is the first time in the documents that we discover that there's something gravely wrong. Schubert wrote that he could not leave the house on account of illness. If these were secondary symptoms of syphilis, the primary infection had probably been discovered 6 to 8 weeks earlier. By the beginning of 1823, Schubert had perhaps suffered from an unsightly rash of reddish-brown spots, swollen lymph nodes, fever. Was the illness caught from a prostitute? What kind of prostitute? It was later claimed that it was Schober who'd suggested that the composer should go out and experiment with a professional. But if Schubert was tempted to do this, and if he was as sexually excitable, as hot and bothered as some of his friends later claimed, Why should anyone else have needed to make such a suggestion? This is typical of the belittling of the composer's intelligence, as if, apart from writing some of the greatest music ever written, he was a child. Did Schubert's admirers later on do their best to protect him by blaming this illness on Schober? The official story, much later, by the middle of the century, was that this was a one-off, a terribly unlucky accident for someone otherwise unsullied by such behavior. But official stories in Vienna are notoriously unreliable, and the truth was probably a great deal more complicated. It's perfectly possible that during these years of 1821 and 1822, after he'd escaped Meyerhofer's scrutiny, Schubert had been in search of love on many an occasion. Since the days of the Congress of Vienna, Vienna was a city made for congress of every kind. That this emergency, this crisis, perhaps developed under the parental gaze, is also terrible to imagine. One can only imagine the father's rage and shame. And we remember, of course, that earlier Schubert had dreamt of actually being struck by his father. On the 5th of May, 1823, Schubert wrote a poem entitled Mein Gebet, My Prayer. It ends with these words: "See, lying in the dust, reduced to naught, a victim of inexpressible grief, the martyr's road that was my life approaches its never-ending doom. Kill it and me, myself kill, cast everything into Lethe, and then, great God, allow a pure and powerful being to emerge." A few weeks after writing that poem, Schubert embarked on the composition of Fierabras, an enormous work, perhaps his greatest opera. Schober was not the librettist, but Joseph Kupelwieser, the brother of Schubert's painter friend Leopold. Schubert's friends from Upper Austria, kinder and more concerned than any of the documents show us, probably decided he needed an emergency period of summer convalescence away from Vienna and the schoolhouse. In July, Schubert traveled to Linz, in those days a 3-day journey in 13 stages. Vogel was waiting there, as was Joseph von Schober. Vogel and Schubert gave several concerts there, and the program included some of the songs from Die schöne Müllerin. Yes, Schubert had already begun working on the cycle to the poetry of Wilhelm Müller. Müller had a connection with folk song and a directness and a musicality in his poetry, and he was a role model for the young Heinrich Heine. And Müller's left-wing credentials and the poetry that he'd written, advocating the freedom of the Greeks, also Byron's cause, of course. This left-wing leaning no doubt made him an attractive figure in the Schubert circle. Franz von Schober, in the meanwhile, the eminence grise in the situation, or so he has been painted by many, had suddenly decided to leave an uncomfortable situation behind him and pursue an acting career in Breslau, 500 kilometers to the north of Vienna. It's hard to avoid the conclusion that he decided to do a runner. It later emerged that he'd been secretly engaged to Justina von Bruckmann, the sister of Schubert's friend, Franz von Bruckmann. And this caused great strife within the circle, Bruckmann hating Schober, and Schubert and Schwind defending Schober against all criticism. While recuperating from the first onslaught of the sickness in Steyr, the composer wrote to Schober. The tone of his words is in the pathetic major key, a tonality reserved for those great moments in Schubert's work of forgiveness and forbearance. I must wish you now again and again all luck in your new undertaking, and assure you of my never failing love, which will suffer unspeakably in your absence. I'm in fairly good health, although I doubt ever becoming perfectly well again. I lead a simple life in every way. I take plenty of exercise, work hard on my opera, and read Walter Scott. When the time came to return to Vienna, living in the schoolhouse must have seemed out of the question. It was time to ask favors of old friends. Schubert moved into a lodging in the Stubenbastei, sharing with a friend named Joseph Huber. It was a house built into those old city walls which were demolished some decades later in order to accommodate the Ringstrasse. Once again, these arrangements have the air of emergency about them. In a letter of the following month, Schubert writes again to Schober. You, dear Schober, I can never forget, for no one else can ever be to me, alas, what you once were. In October, the music for the opera Fierabras was completed against all the odds. There was a distressing stay in the Allgemeines Krankenhaus in the Alserstrasse. Well, whether that was in the spring or autumn of 1823 is variously attested. But we do know that at the behest of the doctors, the composer received painful mercury treatment and temporarily lost his hair as a result. It was also there in the hospital that he completed his cycle Die schöne Müllerin. This work seems to have concentrated Schubert's mind to an unprecedented degree. Like the hapless miller boy of the story, Schubert was seemingly a loser. He was an outcast. There must have been a number of his friends and acquaintances who were worried about what would happen to them if they socialized with him. He'd lost his health, his hopes for the future, and his viability as a sexual partner, should he ever be so lucky. But the triumph in the music is there. every hard-won bar of it. All of Schubert's skill in the making of strophic songs in 1816, the experiment of the Meyerhofer cycle, Einsamkeit, in 1818, his own experience of the loves of ordinary, hard-working people. All of this is drawn upon. And the cycle is a distillation and refinement of many of his earlier songs. The songs of Die schöne Müllerin are so very familiar to lovers of Schubert's music. Rather than speak in detail about the cycle, which would take another entire program, I prefer to indicate here and there how earlier songs helped Schubert prepare the way for this gigantic achievement. The work was built on very strong foundations. So the Miller Boy, to begin the cycle, needs a work song. Here is a work song of a fisherman. It's in 2/4. Schubert seems to have believed that working people, simple working people, sang in 2/4. Of course, for a miller boy, we have the millstones, the mill wheel, the water, and the vigorous optimism of a young man who's setting off for the first time. As playing this music, it's always seemed to me that as my hand turns, I'm kneading the very dough that his flower has kindly enabled. The second song is water music. And my goodness, how much water music in Schubert is there? But come to think of it, that's not just water music, that's a fish breaking the surface of the water, glinting as it does so. No, we have to have something a little bit more tranquil than Die Forelle. Notice that everything I'm giving you is sextuplets, as if the running of water is thought of as being sextuplets. It's a little bit too still, that stream, as the languid youth listens to the word Louisa by the side of it. We want something a bit more lively, perhaps. But that's too lively. This is a little brook, and whereas the beginning of that song, Muhammad's Gesang, where there's a water coming down from a cliffside, this is more sedentary, more under the hands. So for Wohin, we get this. What stops the boy in his tracks is something entirely original. We haven't had a mill wheel in Schubert until now, and he manages to suggest not only the turning of the mill, but the feeling in the boy, is this perhaps it? Is this my destiny? With that intrusive little interlude in the left hand. And because this is no ordinary boy, it's not only about turning mill wheels. He imagines that he hears voices. He imagines that the brook and the nixies are speaking to him.
Ei, willkommen, süße Mühlengesang. Ei, willkommen, süße Mühlengesang. Und das Haus wie so traulich und die Fenster wie blank und die Sonne wie helle vom Himmel sie scheint. Die Sonne wie helle vom Himmel sie scheint. Ei, Bächlein, liebes Bächlein, war es also gemeint. Ei, Bächlein, liebes Bächlein, war es also gemeint. War es also gemeint, war es also gemeint.
The fourth song is a thank you song to the brook. It's very interesting that despite all his trials and tribulations, an appeal to God never occurs in the Müller cycle. He speaks as his confidant to the brook, not to Mary. So the wonderful 1818 song, which is describing Mary, is not suitable. It's very Catholic. And in any case, Müller comes from a very different part of the German-speaking world, the Protestant North. And in the same tonality, the Danksagung, the thank you to the brook, which has nothing to do with religion, but has devoted, almost religious gratitude. The fifth song is the most fascinating of all to me. And here, delving back into Schubert's past has been of enormous interest to me in terms of interpretations. We change interpretations all the time. Any person in my line of work has played a song many different ways, changing their minds many different times. I noticed that the song Attis, composed in 1817, has a lot in common with the famous Am Feierabend, where the miller boy is attempting to work and finding that he simply isn't strong enough to turn the mill wheels with all the strength that he requires to impress the young maid of the mill. The two songs are both in A minor. They are both in 6/8. One is etwas geschwind, and the other is ziemlich geschwind, which to my mind is the same tempo marking. Rather fast. But both songs have got something profoundly in common, and that is two boys who are disappointed in their own manliness. Attis is from Catullus. Attis is a mythological character, a castrated character, who at one point in Catullus says, I, a woman, I, a young man, an ephebe, and a child. He's all those things. As if a woman in a man's body, longing to fly to go back to the Greece that he loves in the service of a strange goddess, and unmanned. And then those rippling 16th notes. The miller boy is unmanned in a different way. He's not good enough. He doesn't compare to other men. He gives us a vision of the disappointment that Schubert feels via the miller boy in his inability to measure up. When you consider the influence of Attis, the change from A minor to A major on the first page, one suddenly realizes that the boy in the beginning of the song in the Schöne Müllerin is tired, disappointed. It's so often sung forte when the singer comes in. It's actually marked piano. It's only when he sees the girl in the middle of the song that he actually redoubles his effort, and the composer asks us to play it faster. So, having taken the tempo of Attis, nobody has ever proposed playing that. I believe Am Feierabend begins like this. And then gets faster in the repetition of that music. The interesting thing is how Schubert's mind works, how certain situations, how certain characterizations bring to mind keys, tempi, ideas that are repeated. And we understand, funnily enough, a great deal more about the miller boy not being a good enough man by understanding how unmanned and helpless Attis felt. The sixth song is a miracle of a combination of recitative and aria, something that Schubert worked on time and time again, where the recit of the opening is in fact supremely melodic. And the young boy asks the mill stream to give him an answer. I need to know, I need to ask whether my heart is deluding me. Does she love me? And then there's silence, as if the mill stream has decided not to answer that question. And it's then that the miller asks, why are you so silent today? Please tell me. The subtlety of the music is amazing. The morning greeting, Morgengruß, is a song that Schubert wrote in 1815 in C major called Sänger's Morgenlied, where the singer greets the morning with passion and love. Compress that, distill that, imagine the young man in the morning, first thing in the morning, in love with the Müllerin. Des Müllers Blumen, Song 9, and Tränenregen are linked extraordinary strophic songs, and certainly Schubert would never have been able to compose these without all the apprenticeship that he served in 1816. There are a number of songs that are entirely new. We haven't heard anything like them before. The mad, unfounded, unreasonable ecstasy of mine. It's a unique feature, holding those thumbs in the minimum position. And it's all because the syllable mein, hein, ein, it's obsessive. It's all he hears in rhyme is that one vowel. And the accompaniment, in its insistence on remaining on the same note, mirrors this in remarkable fashion. This is not simply a boy who is used to love. This is not just another girl. This is a confrontation of a boy with the subject of love, being lovable, being worthy of it, being able to give it, trusting. The whole issue that this work presents is the very reason why it is immortal in the concert hall, that it's not just a sequence of pretty tunes. For Song 14, Der Jäger, perhaps Schubert had had the chance to study some of the Renaissance music in the remarkable library of his friend Raphael Kiesewetter. Der Jäger seems to me to be an absolute Renaissance caccia, associated with hunting in 6/8, full of imitation.
Was sucht denn der Jäger am Mühlbach hier? Bleib, trotziger Jäger, in deinem Revier. Hier gibt es kein Wild zu jagen für dich. Hier wohnt nur ein Rehlein, ein zahmes für mich. Und willst du das zärtliche Rehlein sehen, so lass deine Büchsen im Walde stehen und lass deine klaffenden Hunde zu Haus und lass auf dem Horne den Saus und Braus und schiere vom Kinder das struppige Haar, sonst scheut sich im Garten das Rehlein fürwahr. Und schiere vom Kinder das struppige Haar, sonst scheut sich im Garten das Rehlein fürwahr. Doch besser du bliebest im Walde dazu und ließest die Mühlen und Müller in Ruh. Was taugen die Fischlein im grünen Gezweig? Was will denn das Eichhorn im bläulichen Teich? Drum bleibe du trotziger Jäger im Hain und lass mich mit meinen 3 Rädern allein. Und willst meinen Schätzchen dich machen beliebt, so wisse mein Freund, was ihr Herzchen betrübt. Die Eber, die kommen zur Nacht aus dem Hain und brechen in ihren Kohlgarten ein und treten und wühlen herum in den Feld. Die Eber, die schieße, du Jägerheld.
One of the songs of Weber comes to mind next. Those open fifths giving a sense of rustic celebration. The song is called Reigen. And in exactly the same tonality we have Eifersucht und Stolz, the young miller boy putting on an enormously brave show in the middle of his sadness. Die Liebesfarbe is one of the most sad and bereft songs in all music. We always wonder what's happening when Schubert chooses B minor with its possibilities of going into B major. A minor to A major is another such conjunction. Do we remember that song that Schubert wrote to his own text when Schober left Vienna? Those 16th notes are from Suleika, of course. The sadness of love has seldom been more beautifully presented than in this B minor tonality, full of a heartache. Again, the presence of mill wheels in the presentation changes everything. There is very little in Schubert that is as intense as that, so one doesn't pretend that the cycle is just simply made up of past memories. One of the most impressive things of all is this building of the song Trockene Blumen, from absolutely nothing. And eventually turning into an overwhelmingly powerful funeral march. In the 19th song, listen to a phrase from a neglected and scarcely known Mayhofer setting called Beim Winde. And hear this mirrored in the consolatory words of the mill stream to the miller who has decided he cannot live life any longer and that he needs to die, he needs to kill himself in the mill stream. And there is that receptive voice of nature, exactly that we find in the Mayhofer poem. This is not a question of Schubert looking up an old song and saying, I can take a bit of that and recycle a bit of that rather than do something new. There was never any question of him needing to do that. This simply shows that his mind works in a certain way, that certain images and certain ideas are linked with certain keys, and that he calls on this vast vocabulary of music making when certain verbal ideas, human situations, predicaments, and stories repeat themselves within his songs. Right at the end of the song, Der Müller und der Bach, we have the most unostentatious and sad suicides that ever existed in musical terms. Just those last two bars, slipping under the water. And under the water, the boy lies at last released from all his woes. The music that Schubert finds, which is like something ongoing in 5 verses, something repetitive, a mantra, something that is hypnotic in its repetitiveness. The music seems stationary, and yet it has within it a bit of movement. To me, it's come to mean water entwining lovingly around something solitary, a body that remains wafting slightly in the current, never still, not alive, but blessed with the movement of something alive and caring around it. The more one goes into Schubert's songs, the more one can find the limitless aspects of the composer's imagination, the way that he manages to create pictures, many pictures, some of which they are so profusely given to us, we take up, some which we ignore, and many which we discover late, certainly not immediately. But the music is rich enough to be always waiting in that way to be discovered and rediscovered.
Gute Nacht, wie alles wacht. Gute Nacht, wie alles wacht. Schlaf aus deine Freude, schlaf aus dein Leid. Der Vollmond steigt, der Nebel weicht, der Vollmond steigt, der Nebel weicht. Und der Himmel da droben, wie ist er so weit? Und der Himmel da droben, wie ist er so weit?
We know that Schubert was wearing a wig in early 1824 because he'd lost all his hair as a result of mercury treatment, and it's possible that he had mercury treatment early in the year and more mercury later. In fact, it's very possible that he had consumed so much mercury that the result was damage to his immune system that was going to catch up with him eventually. And the bouts of feeling unwell went on for some time, for the rest of his life really, off and on. And he could still get very depressed. In March 1824, he wrote to his friend, the artist Leopold Kupelwieser, who was studying in Rome at the time. I feel myself to be the most unfortunate and most wretched man in the whole world. Picture yourself someone whose health is permanently injured, wretched, and who in sheer despair does everything to make it worse instead of better. Well, what that means, we don't really know. Schubert continues, I'm someone whose most brilliant hopes have come to nothing. Someone to whom love and friendship are at most a source of bitterness. Someone whose inspiration, whose creative inspiration at least, for all that is beautiful, threatens to fail. Meine Ruhe ist hin, mein Herz ist schwer, ich finde sie nimmer und nimmermehr. That could be my daily song now, for every night when I go to sleep, I hope never to wake again. So do I pass my days joyless and friendless, except when Schwind comes now and again to see me and brings me a ray of light. Meine Ruhe ist hin. His mind goes back to that first important Goethe setting of 1814. Now it's not about poor Gretchen. It's about himself. But Schwind comes to cheer him up. The handsome young Moritz von Schwind, soon to be a famous young artist and painter. And indeed, Schubert had found a younger generation of friends and devotees. And his music, his talent, his ability to create beauty attracted a number of people to his side. Normally young men, although at the Schubertiads, women came too. And he made some important female friends later in his life. Towards the end of the sad letter, we discover the silver lining behind the clouds that is such a feature of Schubert's music and indeed his personality. We are surely all allowed moments of self-pity. We've heard those moments of self-pity as far as Schubert's concerned. But almost as soon as he has said these words, he counterbalances them with others, showing a strength of character that is entirely admirable. I've written very few new songs, but have tried my hand at several kinds of instrumental music and composed 2 string quartets and an octet. And I want to write another quartet and so prepare my way for a big symphony. The latest news in Vienna is that Beethoven is giving a concert at which his new symphony will be performed. This is Beethoven's 9th, of course, and Schubert was certainly in the audience to hear it. In the year 1824, there are only 6 solo songs, as if the composer felt too raw to compose Lieder at this time. But Meyerhofer, who had been in the background in these years of crisis, brought out a privately printed small volume of verse. And thanks to receiving a copy of this, Schubert's response was 5 wonderful settings of his old friend's poetry. One of these was Abendstern, in which Meyerhofer envisages the evening star, Venus, the star of love, as something silent, lonely, bearing no fruit.
Was speist du einsam an dem Himmel, o schöner Stern, und bist so mild? Warum entfernt das Funkel der Gewimmel der Brüder sich von deinem Bild? Stern, sie halten sich von Liebe fern. So solltest du zu ihnen gehen, bist du der Liebe zaudern nicht. Wer möchte denn dir widerstehen, du süßes Eigen sinnig Licht. Ich sehe, schaue keinen Keim und bleibe trauend still daheim.
From May to September, Schubert accepted an invitation to spend another summer as the music tutor of the two Esterházy sisters, countesses, in Zseliz in Hungary. Karolina Esterházy was now 19 and a very accomplished pianist, as well as a charming and sympathetic young woman. Schubert composed wonderful piano duets for the two of them, including the Fantasie in F minor. How easy it might have been for him to have imagined what it would be to go through life with such companionship, a partner who so valued his music, and in such a milieu where all material cares were taken care of. That he was extremely fond of Karolina is beyond doubt. But in the absence of stronger contenders, the way out of reach Karolina has always been the more important of the two women. The other was Theresa Grob, a supposed childhood sweetheart of Schubert's, who have been summoned again and again as alibis with no documents to prove anything by those anxious to give the composer the benefit of the doubt regarding his sexuality. Well, of course, there is no hard and fast, concrete evidence either way as to what the composer's sexuality might have been. Except we may also say that we could give Schubert the benefit of the doubt that had he been born in 1997 instead of 1797, he would have identified as a gay man. I don't believe that for Schubert the summer of 1824 was a time of falling in love lyrically with Karolina or anyone else. However strongly he might have wished that life was easier for him, or that he was made of different stuff. Indeed, he was repulsed by love in all its forms and by aspects of himself which had only brought him immense pain. The thought that perhaps his illness had come about in one desperate attempt to prove to himself that he was the man that other people, that his father wanted him to be. And in that one attempt, a debacle, attempting to be something that he wasn't, he could have ruined his life. Well, that thought is simply heartbreaking. In music, the only incorruptible currency of life, his life, he'd suffered professional disappointments. The ongoing narrative of Die schöne Müllerin, carelessly proofread by his brother Ferdinand, published by the hapless Leidersdorf and issued in 5 badly printed parts with long gaps between the appearances of the various books. Well, no one was swept up by this cycle. The music was scarcely noticed. Yet another failure. And yet this cycle, now famous throughout the world, was a personal triumph for Schubert in a way that no one else recognized, certainly not in a Vienna 60 years before Freud. If listening to music can be therapeutic, how much more so must be the actual writing of it? Schubert's poem, written in extremis, had said that he longed to drown in Lethe and to be reborn afresh. In Die schöne Müllerin, the miller boy drowns, it seems to me, in the composer's stead. This transference is an instinctively self-ministered therapy, leaving Schubert shriven, reborn in a way, as if all his own sorrows about being unloved, never being special to anyone, not measuring up to the normal standards of manliness and success, as if all these dark things had been confronted and then allowed to dissolve in a stream of wonderful music and great art. Of course, recovery was not instant. 1824 was a year of stock-taking and transition. After his extended time in Hungary, Schubert returned to the schoolhouse in Vienna, and a stretch of the emptiest months in his life as a composer. He was back at the teaching grindstone, no doubt. The Arpeggione Sonata was composed in that November, but that was it. The famous singer Anna Milder, one of the idols of his youth, wrote to him in December saying, "Your songs enchant me and they received enthusiastically wherever I sing them. Will you set a poem for me?" Well, this surely was a sign of fame to come. She was the first great singer apart from Vogel who'd taken a real interest in his work. What was going to happen next? That's the very question that's asked halfway through Die schöne Müllerin in the song Pause. Will love's sorrows be overcome? And will this period of doubt be the prelude to new songs?
Laute hab ich gehängt an die Wand, grünen Band. Ich kann nicht mehr singen, mein Herz ist zu voll. Weiß nicht, wie ich's in Räume zwingen soll. Meine Sehnsucht allerheißesten Schmerz durft ich aushauchen in Liederscherz. Und wie ich klagte, so süß und fein, glaubt ich doch, mein Leiden wär nicht klein. Ei, wie groß ist wohl meines Glückes Last, dass kein Klang auf Erden es in sich fasst, dass kein Klang auf Erden es in sich fasst. Streift eine Biene mit ihren Flügeln dich, da wird mir so bange und es durchschaut mich. Warum ließ ich das Band auch hängen so lang? Oft fliegt's um die Saiten mit seufzendem Klang. Ist es der Nachklang meiner Liebespein? Soll es das Vorspiel neuer Lieder sein? Ist es der Nachklang meiner Liebespein? Soll es das Vorspiel